Sir, this seat belongs to the gentleman behind me. Please stand up immediately and move to your assigned seat. Sir, this is your final warning. Leave this cabin immediately and move to another section of the aircraft.
The words cut through the quiet air of the first-class cabin like a blunt blade, sharp enough to draw blood, but delivered with the practiced ease of someone who believed she held the universe in her hands. Eleanor Vance stood in the center of the aisle, her spine perfectly rigid, her tailored navy blazer pressed without a single crease, and her silver hair twisted into a flawless, unforgiving knot at the base of her skull. She did not look like a woman making a mistake. She looked like company policy brought to life under the harsh, sterile glow of the cabin lights. She looked down at Marcus Sterling, who sat in seat 4A, his hands resting lightly on the leather armrests, his dark skin contrasted against the immaculate cream upholstery, his breathing slow and measured. Marcus did not blink, nor did he raise his voice. Yet the sudden silence that pooled around them felt heavier than the cabin pressure at 30,000 feet. He simply stared back at her with eyes that had seen this exact script played out in 100 different cities, in 1,000 different rooms where his presence was treated as an uninvited glitch in the system. Standing right behind Eleanor was Bradley Covington III, a man whose family name was stamped on half the real estate in New England, adjusting his platinum watch with a heavy, performative sigh. "This is a complete joke," Bradley muttered, his voice carrying clearly to the back rows, as his wife, Victoria, clutched her pristine designer handbag like a shield against contamination. "We have booked this specific window row for the last 7 years, and I am not about to spend a 4-hour flight to Denver staring at the back of someone else's head." Eleanor nodded, her face hardening into a professional mask that fooled no one, before leaning closer to Marcus, her voice dropping into a cold, transactional whisper. "Sir, I am going to ask you one final time to gather your briefcases and step out of this cabin so we can resolve this seating discrepancy with our legacy passengers." Marcus did not reach for his bag, nor did he display the anger they were so desperately waiting to weaponize against him. Instead, he lifted his boarding pass with 2 fingers, the printed ink clear and undeniable. Seat 4A, first class, confirmed. Eleanor barely glanced at the paper, her fingers tightening around her digital tablet as she prepared to enforce a hierarchy that had nothing to do with tickets. She had no idea that the quiet man when she was attempting to humiliate in front of a dozen wealthy onlookers was the very reason this flight would never leave the tarmac. She did not know that within exactly 24 minutes, her entire career, along with the corporate survival of Vanguard Airlines, would hinge entirely on whether Marcus Sterling decided to forgive her. But some debts can never be washed away with a corporate apology, and some men refuse to be erased from the spaces they have earned. The terminal at Boston Logan International Airport had been churning with its usual Monday morning anxiety long before the first shadow fell over gate B14. Outside, a low blanket of gray clouds hung over the Atlantic, mirroring the heavy, pressurized mood that filled the crowded boarding lounge. Business travelers, in identical gray suits, paced the polished floors, their eyes darting nervously from their smartphones to the massive departure boards overhead. Vanguard Airlines Flight 412 to Denver was already flashing a crisp amber warning. Delayed 15 minutes. Marcus Sterling stood near the edge of the priority boarding lane, a worn leather portfolio tucked securely under his left arm. He did not tap his foot, nor did he sigh loudly like the tech executives standing behind him. He simply waited with the patient stillness of a man who measured time by results rather than urgency. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored but entirely devoid of loud branding, and on his wrist sat a simple silver watch with a cracked black leather strap. It was an old watch, a piece of machinery that had long outlived its market value, but remained priceless to the man who wore it. His grandfather had handed it down to him on a humid southern morning, just days before Marcus packed his life into 2 cardboard boxes and headed north to Harvard. "Never let them make you feel small in a room you paid to enter," the old man had whispered, his hands rough from 40 years of laying railroad tracks. Marcus had carried that quiet command into glass boardrooms where investors regularly mistook him for the IT support staff. Before he took his seat at the head of the table, he had felt the heavy, silent weight of security guards following him through high-end department stores in Manhattan, their radios hissing with unvoiced suspicion. At 46, he had built Obsidian Analytics into the nation's premier independent audit firm, specializing in detecting algorithmic discrimination within corporate supply chains and public infrastructure. His team wrote the very software that prevented banks and transport giants from burying systemic biases behind the neutral, unfeeling code of automated systems. Today, he was flying to Colorado to deliver a closed-door briefing to the Federal Oversight Committee on Transport Ethics, a presentation that would determine which major airlines retained their federal operating subsidies. The irony of his current situation was a bitter pill, but Marcus had long stopped looking for fairness in the narrow aisles of the world. He watched as the gate agent adjusted her microphone, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of rolling luggage and hushed complaints. "We are now inviting our first class and elite legacy passengers to board Vanguard Airlines Flight 4112 with immediate effect." Bradley Covington III stepped forward instantly, his posture projecting the unshakable confidence of inherited wealth, his wife Victoria trailing closely behind. Bradley was a senior partner at a historic Boston wealth management firm, his hair silvered perfectly at the temples, his charcoal coat announcing status before he even reached for his phone. Victoria adjusted her pearl necklace, her eyes scanning the boarding lane with the cool detachment of a woman who expected the world to clear a path for her arrival. "About time," Victoria murmured, making sure her voice carried just far enough to register her dissatisfaction with the gate agent. Bradley's eyes swept over Marcus, pausing for a fraction of a second on his suit, his worn leather portfolio, and finally the boarding pass gripped in his steady fingers. It was a practiced glance, an instant calculation of worth based entirely on the surface of things, wrapped in a silence that spoke volumes. Marcus felt the gaze, recognized the math happening behind Bradley's eyes, and chose to say absolutely nothing. He stepped up to the scanner, his phone flashed a vibrant green, and the machine chimed its approval. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling. Seat 4A, enjoy your flight," the agent said, her voice robotic, entirely unaware of the storm brewing in her queue. Marcus nodded, walking down the jet bridge into the quiet, climate-controlled belly of the aircraft, leaving the hum of the terminal behind. Behind him, Victoria leaned into her husband's shoulder, her whisper sharp and urgent. "Did that man just scan a ticket for row 4? Bradley's jaw set into a hard, competitive line as they stepped onto the plane. "That is our row." The first-class cabin of the Boeing 737 smelled faintly of fresh leather and expensive coffee, its deep blue seats glowing under the soft white accent lighting. Everything inside the space felt exclusive, isolated, and entirely removed from the chaos of the main terminal just 100 feet away. Marcus placed his portfolio into the overhead compartment, smoothed the front of his jacket, and took his seat by the window in 4A. He leaned his head back against the leather, letting out a long, slow breath as he opened his tablet to review his legislative notes. He wanted nothing more than 4 hours of undisturbed silence, a brief window where he did not have to prove his right to exist in the world he had built. Then the heavy shadow of Bradley Covington III fell across his lap, turning the bright cabin light into a cold, dark stain. Victoria Covington came to a sudden halt right beside her husband, her thin smile vanishing completely as she looked down into row 4. Bradley stared at Marcus as if finding him in the window seat was not a simple logistical error, but a personal grievance designed to disrupt his day. "Excuse me," Bradley said, his voice dropping an octave, heavy with an authority that expected an immediate apology. "You are in our seats." Marcus did not jump, nor did he look flustered. He slowly lifted his gaze from the glowing screen of his tablet. The ambient chatter of the first-class cabin seemed to fade into a dull hum, replaced by an ancient familiar tension that Marcus knew all too well. "Our seats," Marcus repeated, his voice completely level, showing neither anger nor submission. He spoke like a man placing a small, heavy object onto a glass table, waiting to see if anyone would dare to pretend it was not there. Bradley's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the forward galley where the flight attendants were prepping the service carts. Men of Bradley's social standing were entirely unaccustomed to rooms that did not instantly bend to their presence. Doors were held for him, names were remembered by Mathra D, and bad news was always softened by assistance before it reached his ears. Airlines, in his worldview, existed solely to preserve the exact social structure he enjoyed on solid ground. "Yes," Bradley said, crossing his arms over his tailored coat. "My wife and I fly this exact Monday morning route to Denver twice a month, and 4A and 4B are always our seats." Marcus looked at the empty aisle seat next to him, then shifted his gaze to the boarding pass. Bradley was gripping tightly in his right hand. "Your ticket says 4C." Marcus noted calmly, pointing toward the aisle seat across from him. Victoria's face shifted, a sharp, hard line appearing between her perfectly shaped eyebrows as her fingers tightened on her cream leather bag. "That has to be a system error," she said, her voice rising just enough to capture the attention of the surrounding passengers. "Bradley always prefers the window, and we requested it at check-in." "I understand your preference," Marcus replied, his expression remaining entirely neutral. "But my boarding pass clearly states 4A. He held the paper out between his fingers, offering them the undeniable proof of his purchase. Bradley did not reach for it, his refusal to look at the document telling Marcus everything he needed to know about the conflict. The actual truth of the seating chart was completely irrelevant to Bradley. The real issue was that he was being forced to accept the word no from someone he deemed beneath him. An older executive in row 5 shifted impatiently, his heavy leather rolling bag bumping against Bradley's leg as the boarding line stalled completely. A businesswoman in row 3 lowered her tablet, pretending to adjust her glasses, while watching the exchange out of the corner of her eye. A low, toxic murmur began to ripple backward through the first-class cabin, fueled by the minor inconvenience of a delayed departure. "Get someone to fix this right now," Victoria whispered to her husband, her face flushing with a mix of anger and public embarrassment. Bradley lifted a single finger, and Eleanor Vance appeared almost instantly from the forward galley, moving with a swift efficiency that suggested she was responding to rank rather than sound. Her professional smile was perfectly intact when she looked at Bradley, her tone shifting to a warm, welcoming register. "Mr. Covington, is everything all right with your boarding today?" The contrast in her voice was stark and immediate, overflowing with respect for Bradley, yet instantly turning ice-cold before she even looked at the man in the window seat. "There seems to be a significant issue here," Bradley said, gesturing vaguely toward the row. "This gentleman is currently occupying our assigned space." Eleanor looked down at Marcus, her sharp blue eyes taking him in with a single sweeping calculation that lasted less than a second. Suit, shoes, watch, briefcase, skin. Her expression did not offer an open accusation, but it did something far more insidious. It made a definitive decision before a single fact was presented. "Sir," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with a forced polite authority. "May I see your boarding documentation, please?" Marcus handed the paper over without a word, his eyes remaining fixed on her face as she took it from his hand. Eleanor examined the small slip of paper far longer than necessary, her thumb rubbing against the edge as if looking for a forgery. She tapped the screen of her corporate tablet with a sharp, rhythmic click, a small frown deepening the lines around her mouth. The silence inside the cabin stretched thin, becoming heavier with every passing second. Victoria watched Eleanor with a visible surge of confidence, leaning slightly against the seatback, as if the uniform itself had already settled the dispute in her favor. Eleanor's thumb finally paused over the digital screen, her expression hardening as she looked back up at Marcus. "The system does display 4A for your name," she admitted, her voice flat. Marcus remained silent, refusing to offer her an easy exit from the box she was building around herself. Bradley let out a sharp, irritated breath, adjusting his watch again. "Then fix the system error, Eleanor." Eleanor's cheeks flushed slightly under her powder, but she nodded quickly, her professional mask slipping into place. "Let me see what accommodations we can make to resolve this for everyone." She leaned down slightly toward Marcus, lowering her voice just enough to maintain a professional veneer, yet keeping it loud enough for the entire cabin to hear her words. "Sir, Mr. and Mrs. Covington are elite legacy members who have maintained long-standing seating arrangements with Vanguard Airlines for nearly a decade. I am completely certain you can understand the absolute importance of accommodating our most loyal executive customers today." Marcus felt a familiar, cold weight settle deep behind his ribs, not the sting of surprise, but the heavy ache of recognition. He looked directly at her silver name tag, reading the letters clearly. "Eleanor Vance, lead cabin purser. I am also a paying customer who completed a valid transaction for this specific seat," Marcus said, his voice a low baritone that cut through her professional drone. "Of course you are," Eleanor replied, though the words came out entirely empty, stripped of any genuine acknowledgement. "We are certainly not questioning your right to fly with us today, sir." But she was questioning it, and every single passenger sitting within 4 rows could feel the heavy, unvoiced implication hanging in the air. Victoria crossed her arms over her chest, her pearl necklace catching the sharp white cabin light. "There are dozens of empty seats in the back of the aircraft," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Surely this does not need to become a difficult situation for everyone involved." Marcus turned his head slowly, looking directly into Victoria's cold eyes. "This situation became difficult the exact moment you decided I did not look like the person who paid for the seat I am sitting in." Bradley let out a short, cynical laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, come on now, let's not do this. It is just a window seat." "Then I strongly suggest you take your assigned aisle seat and enjoy the flight," Marcus said, his tone entirely final. The air inside the first-class cabin tightened instantly, the collective breath of the passengers catching in their throats. The young tech executive in row 5 stopped scrolling through his phone, his eyes widening as he watched the standoff unfold. A teenager sitting in row 6 quietly raised his smartphone, angling the camera lens directly through the gap between the headrests, the recording icon flashing a silent red. Eleanor noticed the camera immediately, and her trained smile vanished entirely, replaced by a sharp, defensive edge. "Sir, I am going to need you to maintain a respectful tone with our crew and our passengers." Marcus looked back up at her, his hands still resting flat on the leather armrests. "My tone has not changed since I boarded this aircraft, Eleanor." That was the absolute truth, and its undeniable accuracy made her accusation feel even cruder, even more desperate. Eleanor knew it too, her fingers tightening around the edge of her tablet until her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. She was rapidly losing control of a situation she had entered with the absolute certainty that her uniform guaranteed complete compliance. Bradley stepped closer into the narrow row, his large frame crowding the space, trying to use his physical mass to intimidate the seated man. "Listen to me, buddy," Bradley said, his voice dropping into a rough, low growl. "I do not care what kind of game you think you are playing here, but we have been flying with Vanguard for over 20 years. Marcus met his aggressive gaze with eyes that were entirely unmoved, his voice steady as granite. "And I have been living in the United States of America for 46. The words struck the cabin with a force that far exceeded a raised voice, landing like a physical blow against the polished veneer of the aisle. Victoria inhaled sharply, her hand flying to her throat as if the air itself had turned toxic. Eleanor froze, her face hardening into a rigid mask, while Bradley blinked, momentarily paralyzed by the sudden undeniable weight of what had just been named. This was no longer a petty dispute about leather cushions and window views. It was about the invisible architecture of who gets protected, who gets believed, and who is forced to prove they belong. Eleanor straightened her posture, drawing her shoulders back to summon the full weight of her corporate authority. "Sir, I am going to ask you one final time to cooperate with crew instructions so we can prepare this aircraft for departure." Marcus placed his palms flat against the armrests, his body completely still, a mountain of quiet defiance under the sterile cabin lights. "I am cooperating fully with the explicit terms of my contract, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping into a deep resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. "I am seated in 4A, the exact space I legally purchased." Eleanor's eyes narrowed into sharp slits as she tapped her tablet with aggressive precision. "If the cabin crew determines that a seating adjustment is necessary for the order and safety of this flight, you are required to comply." "Then I will require that instruction in writing," Marcus countered, his tone smooth as polished glass. "I will need your full name, your employee identification number, the specific corporate policy under which you are reassignment me, and a signed statement confirming that this adjustment is being made solely to accommodate the personal preference of another passenger." Eleanor's hand stopped mid-air over the screen, her fingers hovering as she looked past his face and saw something that should have made her blood run cold. She did not see anger, nor did she see the explosive reaction she had prepared to report to airport security. She saw documentation. She did not answer immediately, and for one long, suffocating second, the first-class cabin held its collective breath around her. The bright overhead lights caught the subtle shift in her expression, revealing the first fractures in her absolute certainty as her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Her eyes flicked nervously to the teenager in row 6 whose phone was still raised, then to Bradley, and finally back to the man in seat 4A. She had fully expected embarrassment to do the heavy lifting for her, because most passengers folded the moment a uniform stood over them in a crowded space. Most people preferred surrender over a public scene, willing to trade their dignity in the aisle just to avoid the burning stares of a dozen strangers before takeoff. But Marcus Sterling had spent his entire life studying the vast difference between keeping the peace and surrendering his humanity to a system that wanted him invisible. Eleanor shifted the heavy digital tablet against her hip, her voice dropping into a tight, strained pitch. "Sir, there is absolutely no need to escalate this minor issue into something larger." Marcus did not alter his expression by a fraction of a millimeter. "I am simply asking you to document your official corporate request, Eleanor," he said. "That is not escalation. That is accountability." The word seemed to cut through the cabin like a spotlight, pinning Eleanor to the carpet as Bradley let out a loud, defensive scoff. "This is utterly absurd," Bradley muttered, his face turning an angry shade of crimson. "Nobody here is discriminating against you or making this a racial issue. We just want our usual seats for a standard flight." Marcus turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Bradley with the weight of an anchor. "Then why did your usual seating preference become my institutional problem, Mr. Covington?" Bradley opened his mouth to bark a retort, But no sound came out, his jaw hanging slightly open as the simple question stripped away his standard vocabulary. Simple questions are always the most dangerous when the honest answer is ugly, and everyone in the row knew it. Victoria stepped closer to her husband's side, her voice sharp and trembling with irritation. "You are making every single person in this cabin incredibly uncomfortable right now." An older man in row 3 suddenly looked down at his lap, while a tech executive near the aisle cleared his throat nervously, staring out the window. Nobody wanted to admit that Victoria was wrong, because in the most twisted way possible, she was entirely right. Everyone was uncomfortable. Not because Marcus was loud, for he had not raised his voice once, and not because he was threatening, for he remained perfectly still. They were uncomfortable because his quiet refusal to disappear forced them to look directly at the ugly machinery of their own silence. Eleanor drew herself up to her full height, her professional smile completely dead. "I am going to fetch the lead cabin supervisor immediately." "Please do," Marcus said, his voice a calm closing door. She turned on her heel, her sharp shoes pressing into the dark blue carpet with tight, furious steps that echoed down the forward galley. Bradley remained standing in the center of the aisle, his large frame blocking the path like a guard, while Victoria placed her designer handbag firmly on seat 4B. It was a theatrical gesture, a literal planting of a flag over territory she believed she owned by right of inheritance. Marcus noticed the movement, and so did the teenager filming from row 6, the lens capturing every minute detail of the corporate theater. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his eyes shifting to the expensive leather bag sitting next to him, "that seat does not belong to you either." Victoria's cheeks flushed a violent pink as she snapped her head toward him. "It is just a temporary bag." "Then remove it from the space," Marcus said, the words clean, precise, and entirely final. Victoria stared at him, stunned to the core that a man in a plain charcoal suit had spoken to her without a single word of apology or deference. Bradley reached down, snatched the bag away with a sharp, violent jerk that nearly ripped the strap, and muttered something under his breath. "Are you happy now?" Bradley growled. "No," Marcus replied, his voice flat, "just accurate." A few passengers in the rows behind them quickly averted their eyes to hide their reactions, a young woman burying her face in her hands to suppress a sudden smile. At the front of the cabin, Eleanor was whispering urgently to a tall man dressed in a dark Vanguard Airlines vest. James Sterling, no relation to Marcus, was the cabin supervisor, a 46-year-old veteran with a rigid military posture and silver hair dusting his temples. He was the kind of man who believed that operational order and on-time departures mattered infinitely more than abstract truth when the clock was ticking down. He listened to Eleanor with his arms crossed over for his chest, his eyes narrowing as he glared down the aisle toward row 4 before he had even heard Marcus speak. Eleanor gave him the exact version of the story she needed him to believe to protect her own authority. A passenger in row 4 was refusing to cooperate with crew instructions, premium legacy members were being actively displaced, and a massive operational disruption was imminent. James's jaw set into a hard line with every phrase she uttered, his mind racing to find the fastest path to compliance. He did not ask why Marcus's boarding pass displayed seat 4A, nor did he inquire whether Bradley and Victoria possessed valid tickets for that specific row. He only heard the corporate keywords that made his job easier: refusing, disruption, legacy. He began walking down the aisle, his heavy footsteps sounding like a final verdict against the carpet. "Mr. Sterling," James said, stopping right beside Eleanor and looking down into the row with an icy stare. "I am James Vance, the cabin supervisor for this flight, and I understand we are having a significant compliance issue here." Marcus looked up, his face an unreadable pool of calm. "There is absolutely no issue with my ticket, James." James gave a tight, humorless smile that did not reach his eyes. "That is not what I asked you, sir." The tone of the conversation shifted instantly, the air turning cold as customer service dissolved into a direct command structure. James leaned slightly forward, placing one hand on the headrest of row 3 to dominate the space. My crew has asked you to assist us in resolving a seating concern for our legacy flyers, and we need your immediate cooperation so this flight can depart on time. Bradley nodded from behind him, visibly encouraged by the arrival of a higher authority, while Victoria folded her arms, waiting for the final push. Marcus felt every single eye in the cabin locking onto his skin, felt the weight of the phones pointed at his chest, and recognized the familiar trap closing around him. If he raised his voice, they would instantly write him down as aggressive. If he stayed silent, they would interpret his silence as a confession of guilt. If he stood up, they would claim he was physically threatening the crew. If he remained seated, they would charge him with non-compliance. So, he chose the one weapon they were entirely unprepared to face: absolute precision. Your crew is asking me to surrender a confirmed first-class seat, James, Marcus said, his voice carrying an unshakable weight. Not for an operational safety concern, not for mechanical maintenance, and not for a medical emergency, but solely for another passenger's personal seating preference. Is that the official position of Vanguard Airlines? James blinked, his tight smile faltering for a fraction of a second as Eleanor's face tightened into a hard knot. Bradley looked away, his eyes wandering toward the ceiling, as Marcus reached into his inside jacket pocket and removed a small, matte black business card holder. He placed the sleek leather case onto the tray table between them, but did not open it. Before you answer that question, James, I strongly suggest you choose your next words with extreme care. James stared at the black case sitting on the table like a sealed envelope delivered from a dangerous future. For the very first time since he had walked down the aisle, the cabin supervisor began to wonder if the man in seat 4A was not the problem at all. He began to fear that Marcus Sterling was the consequence. James Vance did not like that cold feeling creeping up his spine. He had spent over 22 years in the aviation industry, learning how to read passengers before their minor complaints turned into major operational disasters. He knew how to handle the nervous flyers, the aggressively angry ones, the intoxicated ones, and the corporate executives who used their frequent flyer status like a weapon to bend the rules. He believed with absolute certainty that he could spot a troublemaker before the person even opened their mouth to speak. But Marcus Sterling was not a troublemaker in any shape or form that James had ever encountered in his 2 decades of service. That fundamental miscalculation made Marcus incredibly dangerous to James's professional pride and his unyielding demand for absolute order. The matte black card holder sat on the cream leather armrest, like a silent piece of evidence waiting to be entered into a permanent record. Eleanor kept her eyes glued to it, her breathing shallow, while Bradley deliberately looked out the window, pretending the object did not exist. Victoria stared directly at Marcus's face, searching for any flicker of hesitation or fear, but she found absolutely nothing but an unreadable wall of calm. James cleared his throat, his posture stiffening as he tried to claw his way back to a position of unquestioned authority in the narrow aisle. Mr. Sterling, absolutely nobody on this aircraft is questioning your legal right to fly with Vanguard Airlines today. Marcus did not move his eyes from James's face, his voice dropping into a register that felt heavier than the silence around them. You are not questioning my right to fly, James. You are actively questioning my right to sit in the space I paid for. A profound hush rolled backward through the first-class cabin, swallowing the ambient hum of the air conditioning vents completely. The teenager in row 6 kept his smartphone steady, his thumb trembling slightly against the screen as the recording counter ticked upward. He knew with absolute certainty that he was capturing something far larger than a standard seating disagreement between an airline and a passenger. Every person in the front rows could feel the historical weight of the moment pressing down on the cabin, thick and suffocating. The elderly woman in row 3 closed her book, her mouth tightening into a thin line of quiet, deeply felt institutional shame. She had lived through enough decades in America to recognize exactly when professional politeness was being weaponized as a mask for bias. James's tight smile thinned until it was completely gone, his corporate vocabulary beginning to fail him under the steady weight of Marcus's gaze. "We are simply offering you a reasonable and comparable accommodation in another section of the aircraft to resolve this operational delay." "To whom is this accommodation reasonable?" Marcus asked, his tone cutting cleanly through the supervisor's rehearsed corporate defense. James paused, the honest answer standing directly behind him in a charcoal coat, smelling of expensive cologne and unearned privilege. Bradley's patience snapped completely, his face turning a deep, angry purple as he took an aggressive step forward into the row. "For God's sake, James, just move the man out of our row so we can get this aircraft off the ground before we lose our window. I have a critical corporate connection to catch in Denver, and I am not about to miss it because someone wants to make a grand social point." Marcus turned his head slowly, looking directly at the real estate mogul with eyes that had stared down hostile boards for 20 years. "I am not attempting to make a point, Mr. Covington," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a deep, resonant rumble. "I am refusing to be systematically erased from a space I have earned because my presence makes your routine uncomfortable." The words did not explode into the cabin. They deepened, anchoring themselves into the floorboards like an undeniable truth. Victoria's nostrils flared in anger as she clutched her cream leather handbag tighter against her chest, her voice trembling with irritation. "This is exactly the kind of modern nonsense I mean, Bradley. Everything has to become some grand, exhausting social issue now. It is just a standard leather seat on a standard Monday morning flight, and he is ruining the entire experience for everyone around him." Marcus looked at her, and for the very first time since the confrontation began, a shadow of profound sadness passed over his features. "To you, it is just a seat, Mrs. Covington," Marcus said, his quiet answer stripping away the last layer of her professional anger. That quiet, unhurried response was infinitely worse than an explosive outburst would have been, because it exposed the massive chasm between them. For Victoria, the seat was a matter of basic physical comfort. For Bradley, it was a routine validation of his generational status. For Eleanor, it was a minor service problem to be swept under the rug. For James, it was an annoying operational delay to be cleared. But for Marcus Sterling, that specific leather seat was a heavy repository of memory, a symbol of a promise made decades ago. A younger, vulnerable version of himself suddenly flashed across his mind, a memory buried under 24 years of corporate success. He remembered being 22 years old, wearing his only cheap business suit, holding a ticket he had saved 3 weeks of wages to buy. It had been a flight to New York for an interview that possessed the power to entirely alter the trajectory of his family's life. A white lead flight attendant had stood over him in an identical aisle, telling him there had been a system mix-up and a wealthy donor needed his space. Marcus had moved back then, his heart pounding with terror, because he was young, scared, and valued the interview far more than his fragile pride. He had sat in the cramped back row, staring at the floorboards, promising himself in the quiet dark that he would never allow it to happen again. He had not made that promise loudly, nor had he made it dramatically. He had forged it in the absolute silence of his own conscience. The strongest, most unbreakable promises are always the ones a man makes to himself when there is absolutely nobody else watching him bleed. James leaned in another inch, his voice dropping into a low, threatening pitch that signaled the end of his corporate patience. "Sir, I am going to be exceptionally clear with you right now. If you continue to refuse a direct crew instruction, this becomes a matter of federal security." Eleanor's shoulders visibly relaxed at the utterance of that specific keyword. Security, the oldest and fastest shortcut in the aviation industry. It was the ultimate tool to instantly transform personal discomfort and unchecked bias into absolute, legally binding federal authority over a passenger. Marcus noticed the subtle shift in her posture and smiled, a cold, humorless expression that made James's hand twitch against the headrest. "So, within the span of 10 minutes, a confirmed first-class ticket is transformed into a matter of federal security because I asked for documentation. Your cooperative behavior on this aircraft determines the nature of this matter, Mr. Sterling," James countered, his eyes hardening into flint. "My behavior," Marcus repeated, his hands remaining perfectly flat on the leather armrests, his voice measured, his body contained. He sat there, painfully controlled, a masterclass in restraint, while the system around him actively searched for a reason to destroy him. The older woman in row 3 suddenly leaned forward, her voice trembling but clear as it cut through the heavy air. "This man has not done a single disruptive thing since he sat down, and I am utterly appalled by what I am witnessing right now." The short sentence came out soft, but it broke something fundamental within the collective silence of the first-class cabin. Eleanor snapped her head around toward row 3, her face flushing with anger as she tried to reassert her grip on the room. "Ma'am, I am going to ask you to please remain completely silent and let the trained cabin crew handle this internal operational matter." The older woman swallowed hard, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the edge of her armrest, but she refused to break her gaze. "I am sitting right here, Eleanor, and I am watching exactly how you are handling it, and it is shameful." James's face tightened as a bead of sweat formed near his temple. Independent witnesses always complicated a corporate eviction. From the front galley, the gate agent suddenly appeared at the open aircraft door, her wireless headset crooked, her expression completely frantic. "James, we are less than 2 minutes away from losing our official departure window, and air traffic control is demanding an immediate update." Bradley threw his hands up in the air, spinning around in the aisle, to face the back of the cabin with a theatrical groan. "Perfect. Absolutely wonderful. This is the exact nightmare I was trying to avoid by booking our usual seats weeks in advance." Marcus looked past James's rigid shoulder, his eyes locking onto the frantic gate agent standing by the open entry door. Please ensure your operational log notes that this departure delay began when crew members attempted to remove a paid passenger from his assigned seat. Note that this action was taken without operational cause, solely to satisfy the personal seating preference of another executive flyer. The gate agent's eyes flicked instantly from Marcus's face to the teenager's phone in row 6, and the color drained from her skin. She recognized the exact digital shape of a corporate public relations catastrophe unfolding in real time, and her posture went completely rigid. Eleanor saw the gate agent's hesitation and panicked, her voice rising in a sharp, defensive pitch to shield her record. "Mr. Sterling has been entirely uncooperative with standard seating adjustments and is actively delaying the safety checks for this flight." Marcus reached down and opened the matte black business card holder with a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye in the cabin to his hand. The premium leather unfolded with a quiet creak, and a single matte black card caught the harsh white glare of the overhead lighting. It was not a plastic credit card. It was an engraved executive business card made of heavy, weighted carbon fiber. Marcus Sterling, founder and chief executive officer, Obsidian Analytics. Beneath his name sat a private direct telephone number and the embossed silver-plated seal of the national auditing firm. Marcus placed the heavy card onto the tray table, sliding it forward until it rested right against James's manicured fingers. "Now, James," Marcus said, his voice as calm and unyielding as a closing vault door. "Would you still like to officially escalate this transaction into a matter of federal security?" James Vance stared at the heavy black card, his breath hitching as the embossed silver seal of Obsidian Analytics caught the light. The silence inside the first-class cabin turned from a tense standoff into a suffocating vacuum as the supervisor's mind raced through internal corporate memos. Every employee at Vanguard Airlines had received a high-priority directive from the chief operating officer just 3 weeks prior regarding the federal transport ethics audit. Obsidian Analytics was the firm hired by the government to review the airline's operational licenses, and the name Marcus Stursling was at the absolute top of the briefing decks. James's throat worked visibly before any words would form, his military posture crumbling as he realized he had just threatened the one man who held the airline's future in his hands. Eleanor Vance stood completely frozen, her fingers trembling against her tablet as she watched the sudden, terrifying shift in her supervisor's face. Bradley Covington, the three frowned, leaning forward to peer at the tray table, entirely unaccustomed to seeing an airline official lose their words so completely. "What on earth is that piece of paper supposed to prove to us, James?" Bradley demanded, his voice laced with growing irritation. Marcus did not lift his gaze to meet Bradley's eyes, his hands remaining perfectly relaxed on the leather armrests. "It proves absolutely nothing about my right to remain in this seat, Mr. Covington," Marcus said, his voice smooth and devastating. "My valid boarding pass already established that right. This card merely reveals how deeply you misjudged the man holding it." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, stripping away the last remnants of her professional composure as she realized the depth of her mistake. James quickly took a step back, his demeanor instantly transforming from a commanding officer into a panicked corporate subordinate. "Mr. Sterling, please accept my humblest apologies, as I believe there has been a massive operational misunderstanding on our part today." Marcus looked up at him, his dark eyes colder than the gray clouds lingering outside the cabin window. "No, James. A misunderstanding is a temporary confusion over numbers or schedules. What happened here was a conscious human decision. A misunderstanding leaves no traces, but a decision always leaves distinct fingerprints, and yours are all over this row." Eleanor swallowed hard, stepping forward in a desperate attempt to salvage her position before the situation left the aircraft. "Sir, if my language or actions made you feel uncomfortable in any way during boarding, I assure you it was never my professional intention." Marcus turned his head slowly, looking directly into her frantic eyes. "You did not make me feel uncomfortable, Eleanor. You deliberately tried to make me feel entirely removable." The teenager in row 6 let out a low whistle under his breath, his phone camera catching every nuance of the crew's sudden humiliation. Victoria Covington felt the sudden shift in the cabin's gravity, her rigid posture beginning to sag as she noticed the burning glares of the surrounding passengers. The wealthy executive in row 5 was now glaring directly at Bradley, while the older woman in row 3 shook her head in disgust. The little machinery of social privilege that the Cringtons had relied on for decades was sparking and melting down in real time before their eyes. Bradley refused to yield his ground, his face darkening as he clutched his wife's cream handbag with a white-knuckled grip. "I do not care what corporate title this man holds. This airline has consistently prioritized our legacy comfort for 20 years. Marcus turned his gaze back to the real estate mogul, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. "And that unearned certainty, Mr. Covington, is precisely why this system is completely broken." At the front of the cabin, the frantic gate agent suddenly pressed 2 fingers to her wireless headset, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. Yes, the passenger in 4A is Marcus Sterling, CEO of Obsidian Analytics. I am confirming right now that the lead purser attempted to evict him from first class for a legacy preference. The words cut through the forward galley like a current of electricity, and James felt his knees go weak as he realized the story had left the plane. It was already moving across airline networks, flashing onto the screens of executives in corporate offices who would soon be asking who ruined the federal audit. Marcus reached down, picked up his smartphone from the armrest, and tapped a single name on his contact list. His director of legal affairs answered on the very first ring, her voice sharp and alert. "Marcus, what is the status of your arrival in Denver? I need you to immediately notify the Federal Transport Oversight Committee," Marcus said, his voice echoing clearly through the silent cabin. "Vanguard Airlines Flight 412 has created an active discriminatory service escalation at Gate B14. I have multiple passenger witnesses currently documenting the crew's attempt to use federal security threats to enforce a legacy seating preference. Initiate an immediate, comprehensive review of their operating contract, and suspend our final compliance report until further notice." James Vance closed his eyes as those four precise corporate words landed like a death sentence: potential contract review. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she realized a failed federal audit would cost the airline millions in subsidies and destroy hundreds of careers. She had entered row 4 believing she was protecting a valuable asset for Vanguard Airlines. Instead, she had exposed its ugliest vulnerability to the one man who could dismantle it. James Vance stood paralyzed beside Marcus's seat, one hand still half raised in the air, his fingers clutching his digital tablet so tightly that his knuckles had gone completely bloodless. Eleanor looked as though the bright white cabin lights had suddenly become blinding, her face holding the fragile, hollow stiffness of someone desperately trying to deny what she already knew to be true. At the front of the aircraft, the gate agent touched her headset once more, her voice dropping into a frantic whisper that bled through the silence of the first 4 rows. "Yes, I am still on board the aircraft," she said into her microphone, her eyes locked onto Marcus. "No, he has not been removed from the cabin, and no, airport security has not been called to row 4. That last sentence made James flinch visibly, his shoulders sinking as the passengers in the surrounding rows watched his authority evaporate in real time. Bradley Covington III looked around the cabin, his chest heaving with a furious, erratic anger as he realized the entire center of gravity had moved completely away from his name. "This is absolute madness," Bradley snapped, glaring at the cabin supervisor while waving his hand aggressively. "You people are standing around, acting as if this man owns the entire airline." Marcus turned his head slowly, his dark eyes locking onto the real estate mogul with the chilling precision of an apex predator. "I do not own Vanguard Airlines, Mr. Covington," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant rumble. "But my firm does own the data compliance auditing system that your precious airline needs to legally operate next month." The first-class cabin went entirely dead quiet, a heavy, suffocating silence that felt less like rest and more like the immediate aftermath of a high-speed impact. Victoria's mouth parted in sheer disbelief, her fingers losing their grip on her cream leather handbag as it slid slightly down her lap. Bradley's face lost its color in uneven patches, the deep crimson draining into a hollow, sickly gray under the sterile overhead lights. Eleanor stared at Marcus as if the actual physical shape of his body had altered in the seat. Yet he had been the exact same man from the moment he stepped onto the aircraft. That was the true, silent indictment of the room. Not that he possessed massive corporate power, but that they required power to be explicitly revealed before they could recognize his basic humanity. At the front of the plane, the heavy cockpit door clicked open, and Captain Elaine Porter stepped into the bright light of the first-class cabin. She was 51 years old, thoroughly composed, with close, cropped gray hair and the controlled, deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades making life-or-death decisions under extreme atmospheric pressure. Her uniform was immaculate, her 4 gold bars gleaming on her shoulders, and while her eyes were not warm, they were exceptionally sharp. She took in the entire scene with a single, sweeping glance. James' broken posture, Eleanor's pale face, Bradley standing aggressively in the aisle, and Marcus sitting perfectly still with his matte black business card resting on the tray table. She knew immediately, without a single word being uttered, that this was not a standard passenger compliance issue. "Mr. Vance," Captain Porter said, her voice low, steady, and carrying the absolute weight of command. "Step into the forward galley with me right now." James stepped toward her instantly, looking less like a veteran cabin supervisor and more like a schoolboy called into the principal's office after a disaster. Eleanor attempted to follow closely behind him, her hands trembling, but Captain Porter lifted a single, authoritative hand. "Not yet, Eleanor," the captain commanded, her voice cutting deeper than a formal reprimand. The passengers watched in absolute silence as James leaned close to the captain in the narrow galley, his voice dropping into an urgent, frantic whisper. He gestured once toward Marcus, once toward Bradley, and finally toward the leather window cushion of seat 4A. Captain Porter listened without blinking, her face turning into stone as the gate agent stepped up to add the final devastating confirmation from her wireless headset. "Corporate operations has verified the corporate data, Captain," the agent whispered. "He is Marcus Sterling, the Chief Executive Officer of Obsidian Analytics." Captain Porter's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped in her cheek, her sharp eyes flicking over to row 4 with a profound wave of regret crossing her features. It was not a soft regret designed to repair the damage that had already been done, but a heavy institutional acknowledgement of a catastrophic systemic failure. She walked down the narrow aisle, stopping directly beside row 4, and looked down at the seated executive. "Mr. Sterling, I am Captain Elaine Porter," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "I want to personally review exactly what transpired in this cabin during the boarding process." Marcus looked up, his face an unreadable pool of absolute calm. "I have been asking your crew to document and review this entire transaction since the moment they stepped into my row, Captain." The captain absorbed the weight of the sentence, letting it land exactly where it belonged, on the record of her airline. "Yes, sir, I understand completely," she said. Eleanor's face flickered with a sudden, desperate panic. She wanted to speak. She wanted to explain. She wanted to make herself small inside the narrative she had constructed. But the teenager's camera in row 6 was still up, the white cabin lights were still bright, and the cold facts of the encounter had already begun to harden into stone. Captain Porter turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto the wealthy couple, standing rigidly in the aisle. "Mr. and Mrs. Covington, you will take your legally assigned seats immediately." Bradley stiffened, his chest puffing out as he tried to summon his vanishing status. "Captain, with all due respect, my family has been loyal legacy flyers with this airline for over 20 years. And today, Mr. Covington," Captain Porter said, her voice turning cold enough to frost the window pane next to them, "your legally assigned corporate seats for Flight 412 are 4C and 4D. Victoria looked deeply offended, her jaw tightening. "You cannot possibly be serious about this." "I am entirely serious," the captain replied. 2 words, flat ironclad, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or privilege. Bradley stared at her, waiting for the corporate world to bend to his name as it always had, but the system remained completely rigid. Slowly, bitterly, he stepped aside, his large frame retreating into the row across the aisle as Victoria followed her sharp heels, striking the floorboards harder than necessary. Their movements were stiff, theatrical, and visibly humiliated by the incredibly rare experience of being told a definitive no in a public space. The narrow aisle finally opened up, providing a pocket of clear air around seat 4A, but the invisible damage inside the cabin remained heavy and unresolved. Captain Porter turned her sharp gaze back to the lead purser. "Miss Vance, step away from this row and remain in the forward galley." Eleanor swallowed hard, her voice cracking as she made a final, desperate plea. "Captain, I was honestly only trying to accommodate our elite legacy flyers under standard corporate hospitality procedures." Captain Porter's eyes narrowed into flint. "No, Eleanor, you deliberately attempted to displace a confirmed passenger from his purchased seat without an operational or safety cause." Eleanor's lips began to tremble under her makeup. "Respectfully, Captain, the passenger was actively refusing to cooperate with my direct crew instructions." Marcus spoke before the captain could formulate her response, his deep voice striking the cabin like a final, closing argument in a courtroom. "I did not refuse to cooperate with an airline safety instruction, Eleanor," Marcus said, his hands still resting calmly on the leather armrests. "I refused to be forcefully moved to accommodate a corporate prejudice wrapped in a standard operating procedure." The powerful sentence hung in the air, striking the first-class cabin into absolute silence. Not Bradley, not Victoria, not Eleanor, and not James spoke a single word to counter it. Captain Porter looked down at Marcus for a long, heavy moment, and beneath her rigid professional control, a deep flush of shame rose along her neck. It was not merely personal shame for her crew's actions, but a profound institutional shame, the specific kind that arrives when a system reveals its worst biases through the ordinary actions of ordinary employees. She nodded her head once, her voice dropping into a solemn register. "Then we are going to ensure this transaction is documented with absolute precision, Mr. Sterling." Marcus leaned back against the cream leather cushion, his eyes dark and unwavering. "Good," he said, "because this encounter was never just about a seat." Captain Porter ordered the forward cabin door to remain wide open, a single instruction that instantly shattered the illusion of the cabin as an isolated, untouchable world where crew authority could suppress the truth. Terminal noise drifted back inside from the open jet bridge, the distant hiss of airport radios, and the rattle of service carts reminding everyone that the outside world was now watching. Vanguard Airlines operations was officially listening, and the corporate walls had suddenly developed ears. Eleanor Vance stood in the corner of the forward galley, with her hands tightly clasped in front of her uniform, desperately trying to maintain a neutral expression, while her uneven, shallow breathing betrayed her internal panic. James Vance stood right beside her, his digital tablet lowered to his side, no longer able to use the device as a professional shield against accountability. Across the aisle, Bradley and Victoria Covington sat rigidly in seats 4C and 4D, their faces twisted into the silent, bitter fury unique to wealthy individuals experiencing public humiliation for the first time in their lives. Marcus Sterling remained seated in 4A, looking out the oval window as the gray Boston morning began to break. The ordinary leather seat had never looked more unremarkable, yet that very simplicity was what haunted Captain Porter as she stepped away to speak directly with corporate operations over the galley phone. It was just leather, a window, an armrest, and a plastic tray table. Nothing sacred, nothing rare, and certainly nothing worth stripping a human being of their dignity over. Yet, the unchecked biases of her crew had brought an entire commercial flight to a grinding halt over it. The gate agent stood near the open door, her wireless headset pressed tightly against her ear as she took down the latest commands from corporate headquarters. Vanguard Executive Response Team has officially assumed control of the incident log, the agent announced, her voice trembling slightly under the pressure. They are demanding immediate unedited written statements from every single crew member and passenger involved in the dispute before this aircraft is cleared for pushback. Eleanor's head snapped up, her lips parting as she realized her internal incident report would be heavily scrutinized by the legal division. James rubbed a hand over his mouth, now staring at the floorboards as the realization of his career-ending miscalculation finally settled into his chest. The silence inside the first-class cabin had transformed from an uncomfortable tension into a collective awakening. The teenager in row 6 finally lowered his phone, but the digital record of the crew's behavior had already left the aircraft, uploading to servers where the public would soon demand accountability. The older woman in row 3 turned back to glance at Marcus, her eyes filled with a quiet, hard-earned respect for the man who had refused to be erased. "You stood your ground when the entire system tried to force you out," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet row. Marcus turned his head from the window, looking at her with a gentle, appreciative nod. "The system only has as much power as our willingness to comply with its prejudices," Marcus replied, his voice a steady, grounding force in the cabin. Vanguard Airlines Flight 412 remained at Gate B14. The engines quiet, the departure window lost, but the moral architecture of the room had shifted permanently. The heavy aircraft door finally groaned shut, sealing out the ambient hum of the terminal and leaving a strange, solemn stillness lingering over the first-class cabin. The gray clouds over Boston began to tear open, allowing long, sharp blades of pale morning light to pierce through the oval glass of seat 4A, illuminating the worn leather strap of the time watch resting quietly on Marcus's wrist. He did not look like a man celebrating a corporate victory, nor did he display the superficial satisfaction of someone who had successfully defended his ground. He simply sat in the quiet space, his breathing slow, listening to the muffled whine of the engines finally turning over. The replacement crew moved through the aisle with an unhurried, natural professionalism, checking seat belts and closing overhead bins without a single performative gesture of doubt or unearned authority. Marcus Wass ran his fingers lightly over the smooth leather of his portfolio, his thoughts drifting away from the legal briefs and federal audit documents toward a younger version of himself that had spent decades hiding in the shadows of his own memory. He remembered the bitter sting of the cold air in that Boston terminal 24 years ago, the terrifying weight of a uniform standing over his chair, and the quiet, crushing shame of gathering his bags to disappear into the back of a room he had paid to enter. He had carried that invisible scar through every glass boardroom, every luxury hotel lobby, and every sterile security checkpoint in America, waiting for the moment when the system would try to rewrite his presence as a mistake once again. But this morning, the old script had cracked under the steady weight of an unyielding truth, and because one man had refused to shrink, the entire mechanism of institutional privilege had been forced to grind to a permanent halt. The plane began its slow, heavy taxi toward the runway, moving past the massive glass windows of the terminal where hundreds of ordinary travelers stood watching the silver aircraft glide into the morning light. The silence of the cabin was no longer a weapon used to enforce a hierarchy. It had become a clean, transparent mirror reflecting the basic human dignity that no corporate policy or unearned status could ever strip away. Marcus closed his eyes as the wheels left the concrete, letting the steady pressure of the ascent press him deep into the leather seat, completely contained, completely unbroken, and finally at peace. If this story reminded you that dignity should never depend on appearance, status, or someone else's comfort, like this video. Subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and accountability, and comment stand for justice.